Welcome to the Room to Bloom podcast, equipping you to live redefined, renewed, and restored. I'm your host, Julie Raboa. Let's tackle this week's topic. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Room to Bloom podcast. Today, I have Tanya Roontree, who is a life coach. And today, we're going to discuss, were you emotionally abused? Because for some of us, that is a question. So before we get started, Tanya, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I have a traumatic past, but God has been able to take that and turn it into a coaching ministry and business. And so I try to help people break the chains of generational trauma and abuse.
Wow, that's quite a ministry. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about, your traumatic past and how it affected your relationships, especially in terms of your marriage and your parenting.
Yeah, so my parents were divorced when I was 4, and I mean that's traumatic in and of itself. But then I later found out that the reason they got divorced was because my dad wanted to live as a woman, and this was in the 70s. This was not, nobody knew how to talk about this in the 70s. So we had very little real help and support through that. So I had that abandonment. He chose to live as a woman, and everybody thought it was better if I just wasn't around him anymore. So I had that abandonment wound. And then my mother she had her own trauma that she brought with her into adulthood. She's very angry and emotionally dysregulated, and she became pretty abusive with me the physical abuse started around age 7. And so the way that's affected my marriage and parenting is that the most obvious thing was my own emotional dysregulation in my parenting. Now, I had made a very intentional choice not to hit my children. So in that sense, I did better, but my mistake was thinking that I could do better on my own and heal on my own. I'm not even sure if I understood that I needed to heal. It was just, she abused me. I'm away from her. I'm done with that. But that's not the case. It stays with you until you release it. And so I was a scary mom. I could be very volatile. We had lots of wonderful, lovely times, but I could just blow up. And it's now I understand it's because of, encountering triggers. And those are formed sometimes at pre-verbal stages in childhood. So it's hard work figuring out what your triggers are and all the different ways that a single trigger can show up. It takes years of work. And in my marriage, the same sort of thing, only with my husband, I was afraid of causing any conflict. So I would stuff my emotions and, like you've got a full bottle of soda and you shake it up, you take that lid off and it just goes everywhere. And that's kind of how it was. Just that pressure building and building and building until I would just lose it. And then I blamed myself and I turned all of the anger in on myself. And because I was the broken one, obviously he'd come from a perfect family. And so, he couldn't be doing anything wrong, which was crazy. And, our marriage started to improve when I finally understood that I wasn't the only sinner in the relationship, that his family did have some dysfunction. But then it was an even bigger turn when I realized that I was no worse a sinner than my husband. So, it's been a process of recognizing that abandonment wound and how it was showing up in my marriage and how it caused problems.
Well, it sounds like that whole process of healing, you really discovered quite a few things, and that takes a lot of humility to do as well.
Oh, yeah.
You used the term emotional dysregulation, and I was hoping you could define that for people who may not know what that means.
Yeah. So emotional regulation is when you are able to notice that you're having some feelings, but you don't have to express those feelings. You don't have to cry. You don't have to yell. You don't have to curl up in a ball and withdraw. You can stay present and not lose it when you're emotionally regulated. When you're emotionally dysregulated, it's very difficult to not cry. Or not get angry and not have those reactions, because when you encounter a trigger, it kicks you into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And when your nervous system is in that mode, it cuts off the command center of your brain. And so you are really not able to make decisions. And that is what it feels like. It feels like you are just a slave to what is coming out of you. So the goal is, by identifying triggers and figuring out why it's triggering, what the story behind that is, and going back and kind of rewriting the narrative that you have in your head about that trigger, and you can recognize it, go, oh, well, that's not what's going on here. I can hold it together. It's fine. And maybe I need to do some work on that later, but I'm okay now.
I think that's really an important point, because when we've gone through really traumatic things, it is really hard for people to contain their emotions or even process their emotions. And so a lot of times people feel shame about the ways that they react, when really it's a result or a lingering effect of that trauma. I was hoping that you could define the difference between what a life coach is and a therapist is, because you are a life coach. So what is the difference there?
Yeah, well, a therapist, a licensed therapist, is allowed to do certain therapies that a coach is not. That's the biggest difference. The other really big difference is that coaches do try to stay in the forward momentum, and coach therapists are trying to heal the past. Now, in coaching, what we run into is that there are limiting beliefs, and those limiting beliefs were formed in childhood. And so we do have to go back sometimes and figure out where those started. And with Christian life coaching, my goal is to find a way to help my client become more gospel aligned in what they believe about themselves, about the world, and about God. And so when we find those limiting beliefs, usually they're not based in truth. And so we look at what the Bible says, and we want to renew our minds by thinking God's thoughts.
Right, because I can imagine, if someone had experienced abuse, and maybe some of that was verbal or physical, you would internalize feelings of a lack of worth. For sure, if someone's, especially somebody who's supposed to love and care for you, is treating you so unkindly. Which brings me to another question. Maybe we can define what emotional abuse is.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to read you a definition. Emotional abuse is really an umbrella term that encompasses all of the different forms of abuse, because emotional abuse is any behavior that shames, punishes, controls, demeans, manipulates, deceives, or neglects. It includes physical, verbal, sexual abuse, betrayal. The most common kind of abuse is verbal abuse and emotional neglect. But you brought up value, and what emotional abuse is a wound to our identity and our value.
Yeah, that's a really powerful statement, because I think so many people have endured emotional abuse and maybe didn't even know that that is what was happening to them. And actually, when I was doing a bit of research about, our podcast, I did a Google search on emotional abuse, and the domestic violence hotline website kept popping up. And so I clicked on it and I thought, wow, certainly emotional abuse in some cases could be considered domestic violence. And I'm not talking about something that happens, once in a blue moon when someone's having a heated argument, but something that may be happening on a more frequent basis that really robs a person of their emotional health and their value.
Yeah. It's more of a pattern or cycle of abuse rather than you're having a bad day and you feeling manipulative. It's a pattern.
Yeah. So thank you for explaining that to listeners, because I think that physical abuse, of course, is more obvious and sexual abuse is more obvious. But sometimes emotional abuse can show up in really sneaky ways.
Yeah. Bruises and physical wounds will heal, but it's the damage done on that emotional level, that you don't see that makes it abuse. Yeah.
Yeah. And it also has that lingering effect that affects our relationships moving forward. I was wondering if there were some signs that somebody might notice in a relationship that might flag them that perhaps this relationship might fall under that abusive category?
Yeah, there's several levels of kind of warning signs. One can be just anxiety, that it'll just show up and, you're not sure why. And sometimes you do know why, because you're afraid of upsetting the other person, or you're looking for signs, what's the mood? And, is this going to be a bad day? Is this going to be a good day? And you're, walking on eggshells, and trying not to upset the other person. Another sign can be suicidal ideation. If someone might not necessarily be actually wanting to kill themselves, but if they were thinking things like, I'm not sure if I can go on living, or I'd be better off dead, that's probably a sign something needs to change.
Yeah. So thank you for also pointing that out. And so we've been talking about trauma, and there is something called complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So trauma, the definition of trauma is an emotional state of discomfort and stress resulting from memories of an extraordinary catastrophic experience which shattered the survivor's sense of invulnerability to harm. And that can be, it can be very specific to the individual, where they were traumatized by something that somebody else maybe wasn't. Then there can be other things like, natural disasters, your home blows away. Pretty much anybody would be traumatized by that. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, happens if somebody doesn't get the help processing the trauma. That can turn into post-traumatic stress disorder, which involves anxiety, difficulty sleeping, difficulty eating, overeating, engaging in comforting behaviors like alcohol and drug use, nightmares, flashbacks. They can be triggered by similar situations or aspects of the situation that they were in, like if they were in a tornado, any siren could set them off and they just, start trembling. The difference between PTSD and complex PTSD is that the trauma occurs repeatedly, and it's by someone who usually a child is dependent on, but it also can happen in marriages, especially when women are being abused. They're dependent on the man a lot of times. So it's a cycle of abuse, appeasement, abuse, appeasement, abuse, appeasement. And it results in a lot of the same symptoms as PTSD, but one of the common ways that it can show up is a flat affect. And so this is like zero emotion, because the person who has complex PTSD has probably learned how to just stuff everything down and not feel and not feel and not feel. And so then they can't feel. And an example of this from my own life was when I was 16, the Space Shuttle Challenger blew up, and I was watching it live on TV in my chemistry class, and I had no emotional reaction to it. I couldn't even understand why my teacher was crying. It just didn't register with me. Oh, and I guess I was 17, because it was a year later on the anniversary. I'd gotten married. I was in a safe place, and the anniversary came and they showed the footage, and I just fell apart. But I had put a lid on my emotions at home, and it was a really strange experience to have that reaction 1 year later.
Well, I really appreciate your explanation and your example of that, because from my own upbringing, that's definitely something that happened to me as well in various situations, just as a result of containing emotions, because any form of emotion that was shown with my mom's mental health, if it didn't align with her, it wasn't okay. And so for people who are listening and kind of maybe recognizing like, hey, maybe I do have some complex post-traumatic stress disorder, what are some things that they can do to begin healing from that?
Therapy and coaching. Coaches that are trained in trauma can help. And I have an additional certification as a mental health coach, and I bring those skills into the life coaching as well. But talking to somebody, it's not something you really can do on your own. And if you can't afford therapy, if you can't afford a coach, some substance abuse programs are well, it's getting more and more common that substance abuse programs start with healing the trauma first. So there might even be some support groups, even if you're not addicted to a substance. It could be helpful to go to a group like that, because they know how to deal with trauma. If you can find a trauma-informed pastor, and, trauma-informed, maybe formal or informal, maybe someone who has just worked with a lot of traumatized people and understands what they're going through and what effect trauma has. But just don't try to do it alone. It's just, you have to have support.
I know for a lot of people who have been through various types of abuse, often keep all of that stuffed within themselves because of shame and fear, guilt, maybe that somehow that they were responsible for this. And I know that even opening up to anybody about this can be really a huge step for them. So I also wanted to mention that some churches have pastors on staff who are licensed mental health professionals. For example, my local church has that. We're fortunate in that way. And also there is a ministry called Lay Counseling that is an outreach of the church where people who perhaps don't have the funds to pay for therapy, it might be a good place to start to talk about these things in a really safe place.
Yeah, if your church does have a lay counseling ministry or a pastor on staff who can provide that kind of counseling, that's also a good option. My brain doesn't go there first because we live in a very small rural community and we don't have those resources. My husband and I kind of provide that for our church, but on an informal basis.
Well, what a blessing it is to have somebody who is informed on these issues, because not only does it affect our mental health, but it also affects our spiritual health as well. As you were saying, our identity is damaged when we encounter these things. Since emotional abuse is often a precursor to physical violence, which may or may not be part of a person's relationship, how can a person discern whether or not a relationship is even safe for them to continue with?
First and foremost, if you really don't feel safe, like if you feel like your life is in danger, if threats have been made against you physically, especially if there are weapons in the house, and of course, there's always knives. If you really think that you're in danger, you need help getting out. And, if you've got a pastor you can trust, and very often law enforcement needs to get involved. If you really think there's imminent threat, call law enforcement. If you are afraid it will get to that point, call your pastor and have him go with you to law enforcement. But if you are getting to the point where you just don't think you can keep going, the anxiety, the walking on eggshells is just getting too much for you, it's at least time to seek some kind of intervention in the relationship.
Yeah, I think you do make a good point that if you're reaching your breaking point, but maybe, your life isn't threatened, perhaps it is time to seek help, because I know in my own situation, it's very difficult to set boundaries and address abusive behavior when you yourself maybe don't even understand what has been happening in the relationship or steps that you can take to improve that relationship by setting boundaries. So help can be invaluable.
Yeah. And one of the biggest challenges when you're in an abusive relationship is just feeling like you have any agency. And this is true for women. This is why, you hear, I don't know why she doesn't just leave him. Well, it's hard. There's dependence there. There's fear of what life's going to be like if she gets out. For kids, it's even harder because they may not even understand that they're being abused, and then to know where to turn is another challenge for kids. A woman might know where to turn, but just not have the courage to do it and not feel like she has the support to do it. But a kid, just may not know. So, there again, if there happen to be any teenagers listening who feel like they need to get away from home, and this is not just you're not happy with the rules, it's when there's volatility in the home, when either the rules keep changing, if there's a threat of physical violence, going to a trusted pastor, or most municipalities have youth officers, and they're not just there to catch kids doing wrong. They are there to support kids, and they will work with kids who do not feel safe at home. That's an option too.
Well, I appreciate you pointing that out, because I was one of those kids as well that didn't realize that all of the things that were happening in my household were abusive. And I didn't understand that until I actually met my future husband, who was a psychology undergraduate at the time. And he observed my mom's behavior and said, I think your mom has a personality disorder. And I just said, what is that? Like, I don't even know what that is. And he said, I was a young adult. He said, you might want to move out. And I was like, I live in California. Like, it's super expensive here, and I only make $500 a month. And so I think when, we are reaching the young adult point, it's really important to find out who you can trust or evaluate it and find out who's got your back in the community, so that you have options, and make a plan maybe to become financially independent as soon as you can, so that you're able to leave the environment that isn't healthy.
Yeah.
But I know that most people ultimately want to have restored relationships. And I do believe that that's what God wants for us as well. So for those who want a restored relationship, what are the signs that that relationship is possibly salvageable?
Well, if the one who is abusing is willing to get help, if they can say, yeah, I'm messing up, I don't know how to change, but I want to change, then there's hope. And also the one who's abused, there reaches a point where their heart may be too hard and they just don't want the restoration. I cannot see myself living with this man for the rest of my life, and I am done. If you're married to a narcissist, then everything is your fault and nothing is their fault. They cannot see their faults. They're either the victim of somebody else persecuting them, or, they're so wonderful that they couldn't possibly be doing anything wrong. And in those cases, really the only way to escape the narcissistic abuse is to leave the relationship. But anybody can have some narcissistic tendencies, but if they're able to say, oh, yeah, I can see where I'll try to change, and, so we want that on both sides. Both are ready to change, to heal. Abuse isn't always one-sided. We can do things to each other in marriage, especially, and in parenting. Kids are more innocent, but in marriage, in my marriage, I was probably more abusive to my husband, just by my angry outbursts. But there was some emotional neglect on his part, so it was, we both had to recognize the ways that we were hurting each other. And we both had to be willing to work on ourselves. We both had to be willing to change and to forgive. With kids, I think, rebellion can be hurtful. And that's sort of the other side of it. They may respond in rebellion, and the parent may be ready for them to just get out. There's that two-sided aspect of the parent-child relationship.
Well, I would just reiterate some really important points that you made for people who really want to have restored relationships, whether it's with a parent or a spouse or their children, that really humility is required for both parties to recognize that, nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes and we all hurt each other, sometimes unintentionally and sometimes intentionally. And so that acknowledgement of our own sinfulness goes a long way in healing the relationship, and also the willingness to forgive. So I think that those are some really important things that you pointed out. But for people who want to begin the process of healing their family relationships, what are a few steps that they can take? If, let's say, both parties are already willing to go through that process, what are some things that they could do?
Well, the very first thing I would say is, find a good counselor or marriage coach. If we're talking about a marriage, a family therapist or a coach who works with families, if you're talking about, parent-child abuse. And in that setting, getting the perspective of a third person as they hear you talk to each other and talk about your marriage, they will be able to point out just the problems in the way that you communicate. They can help you grow in your emotional intimacy and just teaching tools to help in relationships, ways to listen better, ways to talk about feelings that don't feel like an attack. Conflict resolution that ends up with productive conflict. Our goal is never to avoid conflict, but when there is conflict, to learn how to deal with it in a productive way so that you grow in your relationship. And with parents and children, again, learning communication skills. The parent is going to need to work on their own trauma because it's usually that traumatic cycle that is producing the abuse in that person. And also the child, the help that they need is understanding what has happened to them and why it was wrong for that parent to be treating them that way, to kind of help them express their feelings about what's going on. And that looks different at different ages and different personalities. But kids are very willing to forgive. They just want their parent to love them. That is what they really want. And when the parent begins behaving in more loving ways toward them, it will soften them. And you can get to the point where, child's heart is so hard that they go into that rebellion and they just are not going to have it. Then it's probably a road of difficulties for them until they're ready to process that and stop just being angry.
Well, I really think that you are wise in recommending a third party, whether it's a coach or a counselor, to mediate, because they can not only point out, maybe areas that each person is lacking and can improve in their communication skills. But I think that in learning how to productively do conflict resolution, which many of us haven't learned, especially in dysfunctional households. But also in cases with children, I think it's a safe space because there is an unequal power dynamic between the parent and the child, where the child may not feel safe in the home expressing those feelings, where the parent it may enrage the parent unintentionally by speaking up for themselves.
Yeah, and it's a little tricky. And when I say counselor or therapist, I include pastors in that, because pastors end up being, pastors are very often first responders when it comes to, family crises and stuff like that. But yeah, the tricky thing is that it takes time for that child to start to feel safe, even when there's a third party there, because they're going to fear retribution at home. And that's one thing that the parent is going to have to understand from the very beginning, is that whatever that kid says cannot be held against them, cannot be punished when they get home. A lot of times a counselor is going to want to see that kid alone, so that they do feel safer. But it's going to take a lot of reassurance. It's going to take trust building. They might be able to share a little bit, and then see if next time, see if there's any retribution. Did mama find out about this?
And that's such an important point, because I know in my own household, like you were talking about narcissistic personality disorder, and my mom had borderline personality disorder, which has some similarities. And so in my household, anything that I said would at some time be later used against me. And so no conversation was safe. And so I think that's a really important point too, that perhaps sometimes counseling for the child alone is a good place to start for families that want to, begin that healing journey.
Well, and I would say, children need that support, but for things really to change, a lot of parents will send their kids to therapy thinking it's a problem with the child. Children use behavior as communication. So if there's a behavior problem, they're trying to tell you something, but it's not that they're a bad kid. They're trying to tell you they see what's going on and they don't like it. And so anytime a parent is seeking help for a behavior problem, they need to be in therapy themselves, because they're bringing something from their past into their parenting relationship, and nothing's going to change until everybody changes.
Agreed. And from what you said, I also have my own experience where as a teen, there was a period where I was trying to instead go live with my father because it was a safer environment for me, and it enraged my mom. And she sent me to therapy as the one who needed to be fixed, when in fact, the origin of it was the mental illness. And so I think, again, you make another wise comment. But I know we're needing to wrap up here soon. So I was hoping you could explain why you feel that faith is such a crucial component to the healing of ourselves and our relationships.
Yeah. There's a lot of healing that people can do without the spiritual element. They can certainly learn new skills. They can learn to look at things differently. They can learn how to release their pain, their trauma. But without that spiritual component, it's not a whole picture. And God is the great healer. Well, Jesus has overcome the world. So any trial or tribulation that we've gone through, he has already overcome it. But we need to surrender our pain to him, surrender the things that we've done in our pain, surrendering all of that to him and getting that forgiveness, because it's that forgiveness from our Father that really is the missing piece. What you need is forgiveness from the one who is our judge, the one that we are going to answer to. And that is what's going to ultimately bring us the greatest peace, and, knowing his love and forgiveness.
Well, and maybe even also sort of overriding the false beliefs that we have about ourselves as a result of the way that we've been treated, and instead embracing our true identity in Christ, which is loved, children of God, restored and healed and whole. And those are things that secular psychology can't offer us, which is why I think Christian coaching and Christian mental health services are such an important resource for people. Do you have any favorite scriptures on the topic that we've been discussing today to share with us?
Yeah. And primarily, there's a lot of scriptures that deal with abuse, but as a coach, I like to focus on the positive. So my favorite verses, the passage in Ephesians 3, where Paul is praying for the Ephesians, and he wants his readers to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge, that you will be filled with all the fullness of God. And pairing that with 1 Corinthians 13, that first part of 1 Corinthians 13 that talks about what love really is. It's not just the warm, fuzzy feelings. It's the long suffering. It's the bearing of all things. And that's how we get to understand the nature of God's love. All of those traits that you see in that passage that we only hear at weddings, and it sounds so pretty, but doing the work of really looking at that and seeing what love is and what love is not, and getting to know God's love that way, and understanding that love is directed at you, that he takes delight in you. And that being rooted and grounded in God's love is what gives us our identity. That he loved us so much that he gave his only son so that we could be in the presence of God. That is where our identity and value come from.
Well, amen to that. I love that. Because love is not only a feeling, but it's also an action, which really, the ultimate love was in action on the cross.
Yes.
So I just appreciate this deep conversation that we've had so much today, Tanya. And how can listeners find out more about your coaching services?
My website is Reap in Joy Coaching, and I have a couple of pages that describe what coaching is and does, and different packages I have. And if you look for the tab that says book now, you can book a free 30-minute discovery call with me. I also have a Facebook group called Christians Breaking the Chains of Generational Trauma, and that is where you can find tools for healing and changing and learning how to do things differently. And it's going to be a safe place for Christians to have honest discussions about generational trauma and abuse.
I think that sounds like such a wonderful resource. And so the links to those will be in the show notes. And so it sounds like you are local in your community, but also available online for anyone seeking services.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanya. And we will put those links in the show notes. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us today.
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thanks for joining me. I hope this episode has blessed you. If so, please subscribe, comment, and share. It's a great way to spread the love and keep good content rolling. As a reminder, this podcast is purely for informational and educational purposes only. Listening to content is not a replacement for medical or mental health care. Please make decisions with your personal care providers. Stay tuned for next week's episode. But if you want more content or free resources in the meantime, head over to FromBudToBloom.com. See you next time. Until then, live fully free in Christ.